Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from 21 Pilots called Scaled and Icy. You know, at some point in the past couple of years, my relationship to the music of 21 Pilots shifted. And I'm not really sure what happened. And the weird thing is I'm not sure I can pinpoint when it actually changed or what actually changed, but I know that something did. Going back to their albums, I still think that Vessel is pretty great, and Blurry Face is one of my favorite albums of the 2010s, and to my astonishment, it still holds up. And even if I'm a fair bit cooler on Trench than a lot of people, it still produced some great individual songs, and I think The Hype, quietly one of the best cuts of 2018. But somewhere in the past year and a half, I realized that my investment in the new music from 21 Pilots was starting to fade away. And again, I wasn't really sure what sparked it. Maybe it was being underwhelmed when I saw the duo live at a festival in 2019. Now, granted, at the same festival, I had Joji, Pup, and even the 1975 blow past all my expectations, but still, or I don't know, maybe it was Tyler Joseph's dumbass antics on social media across 2020, or maybe it was just so many other acts appropriating what 21 Pilots did, and even if they didn't do it remotely well, the sound began losing some luster, glaring straight at AJR and Grandson here. Although you can trace a lot of 21 Pilots' DNA to a lot of the Fueled by Ramen signings the past 5 or so years, the majority of which have underperformed or imploded, and that's not even counting everyone that's trying to rip them off. Or you know what, maybe it was just the guitar. That was always something somewhat unique about 21 Pilots at their start. For all their weird genre mashup and all their pomp and all their circumstance, they never really seemed like traditional rock stars, which forced them to get kind of creative to build some of their more ambitious bombast. But when Level of Concern became a one-off quarantine moment, and we learned that Tyler Joseph was learning guitar behind the scenes, I don't know, a part of my enthusiasm seemed to slip a little bit, because even despite being 21 Pilots, some of that unique restraint was starting to slip away. And when Shy Away just sounded like an off-brand Strokes song, albeit a pretty great one, and the new album was clocking under 40 minutes, I started to get the uncanny feeling that this would not wind up as interesting or as thought-provoking as they had been in the past. And when you pair that with the fact that their lore, it's felt perennially undercooked no matter what the clique would say otherwise, especially given just how self-referential so much of their material has felt, I just could not escape that gut feeling that Scaled and Icy might wind up disappointing me. Hell, maybe I'd be wrong, I'd be thrilled to be wrong, but even if the slightly muted social media hype and somewhat of the mixed critical reception I had seen had me a little worried about this, so how is it? You know, I made a point early on when I covered Trench that I was kind of shocked that Fueled by Ramen let them ship that record in the state that it was in. A defiantly uncommercial move that was way more murky and abstract and did not produce anything close to the pop crossover single hits that Blurry Face did. Yeah, it did really well on the rock charts, but that label hasn't been trying to make rock music for a while now, let's get honest here. And as such, there is a part of me that listens to Scaled and Icy and hears something that's compromised, which is why the album feels brighter and about the most accessible that this band has ever been. But is that to their detriment when you can then make the very stark comparisons to the acts that have been ripping them off with far less critical acclaim, but maybe even a little bit more commercial success, especially recently? It's one reason why this album has been getting a lukewarm reception at best, even from some of the die-hard fans. And this places me in a very awkward position, because I don't think this album is bad at all. And while part of that comes from overexposure to everyone who's tried to rip off 21 Pilots, another part of this comes from the distance I've had from the minutia of their lore, or an actual understanding that so much of that lore is highly metaphorical or self-referential. And especially coming off of the arc and Trench in the themes, this was a band in prime danger of eating its own tail. But the thing is, they already kind of went down this path with Blurry Face, so Scaled and Icy starts feeling like wandering through an increasingly hollow web of mirrors. Again, not at all a bad wandering, because if you've been following this sort of thematic continuity of this band, there's actually a real emotional core to this that I don't think is getting nearly enough credit. But you know what? If you only hopped on board with Trench, or you considered everything that they did before this a jumbled, pretentious mess, or in fact you were on board from the very start and you're now getting to this point, I think this album might lose you. And I kind of get why. But you know what? I'm going to start off with the sound on this album, and where I'll probably have way more to praise than many might expect. Again, my biggest point of contention with 21 Pilots for a while now, they've got a great pop instinct that they probably could have afforded to drill into more effectively, which is always the biggest reason I've always considered Blurryface their best album, especially in terms of overall polish. And conversely, where I liked some moments on Trench, that was an album that prioritized atmosphere over their best hooks, and I think it was a missed opportunity. Now, Scaled and Icy's going back in that Blurryface direction, but instead of picking up the cod reggae tones that the band used to have, their melodic sensibilities are settling closer to a retro rock and roll sound, closer to songs like Not Today or even Tear in My Heart. And that's a bit of a dicey move, because that's also been the foundation point of AJR's last 3 albums, and when you have a band with that much shrieking presence in the scene, to say nothing of their recent chart success, it kind of makes the comparison very obvious at the front of the mind, and I've seen it in a lot of reviews thus far of this album. Now, I'd actually argue this winds up being a boon for 21 Pilots, because I don't hate retro melodies. I still hold Not Today as one of my favorite 21 Pilots songs, so that I know they can do this sound well. For a band that's as consistently Midwestern as 21 Pilots, it is a point of inspiration that feels a little bit more grounded in the artifice of small town Americana, so it feels a little bit less plastic coming from them, a little bit more organic, and most importantly, 21 Pilots knows what a bass line is, so there's some actual groove here. But 21 Pilots also pulls from a broader pool of retro beyond what the jauntiness of Good Day and Bounce Man have. I've already mentioned Shy Away as being like an early Strokes song in everything but name, and honestly a pretty great one. But that rollicking, hazy revival feels so turn of the millennium, and it was already pioneered on the Hype on the last album, but it's back even stronger on cuts like Saturday, and especially Never Take It, which gives me the vibes of a Robbie Williams song or a New Radical song in so many different ways. But even Choker has some of that with the dance rock breakbeat. Or take the Benny and the Jets melodic parallels on Mulberry Street that feels ever so slightly askew and trying to imitate some of that New York glamour, or how Formidable feels like a chintzy infomercial that would have played throughout the 90s, especially with some of those horns and guitar pickups. Hell, what threw me the most here was that synth bass on No Chances, which honestly sounds like it was pulled straight from an Ayreon song from 010110001. I don't know if Tyler Joseph even knows that that progressive metal act exists, but that tone is instantly recognizable. Even if any of the deeper parallels and themes between this album and that one, that might just be coincidental, but they did come to mind. But you know, the last 2 songs on this project have such a jarring tonal shift that you have to consider it intentional. The mix gets a lot deeper and heavier, more atmospheric. The synths get a lot colder, the percussion shuffles a little harder, the integration of choral vocals on No Chances, the percussion as a whole feels more programmed. It's almost like the uneasy, foreboding cloud lurking across every edge of the entire album is finally swept into view, and it feels like the pitch black tones that suffocated Trench, they've now roared back into the picture. Now, a lot of fans have highlighted the continuity that resumes in earnest with this particular set of songs, trying to figure out how all this ties into the Dima and the Banditos. I recommend you check out my review of Trench, where I try to explain some of the lore and the roots to all the symbolism there. But you know, if we go past that, look at themes, keep in mind that the last album was torn in between the wild, untamed, unpredictable artistic impulses that desperately wanted to break free, and the sympathetic but ossifying forces that wanted to keep Tyler Joseph's creative ambitions locked in place, which included both his own Blurryface-esque insecurities, but also expanded to target their roots in both the industry and maybe even the fanatical fan base that they had already had to try to ward off years earlier. And before said fan base tries to eat me alive, as they've done before, keep in mind that the framing of the Dima has always been morally ambiguous. Even where they come across this album as somewhat kind of implacable, but also more just inevitable. Because while this album is not written with a chronological flow in mind, you can tell how Tyler Joseph knew that how it was going to start and exactly how it was going to end in his own little creative diversions. Scaled Nicely was always going to have a dark and melancholic ending, which might be why Tyler Joseph's nasal vocals are never quite able to properly sell the upbeat cheeriness of the Americana he's appropriating. And sure, some of that feeds into the realistic juxtaposition of simpler vibes undercut with something darker. We've been down this road many times before, but what are the roots of the darkness here? Hell, some of the moments when Tyler Joseph sounds the most animated are on Bounce Man and Shy Away. Songs where the underlying message is for someone to get out. Either chase their dreams or avoid some sort of dark consequence that might be chasing them. But emphasis on the get out part, because maybe what's coming isn't really after them, but coming for Tyler Joseph instead, and he knows it. And this is where things get really interesting with Scaled Nicely, because Tyler Joseph has emphasized that the title is short for Scaled Back and Isolated. Recorded primarily in quarantine back at home, this is an album that feels like a retreat, going into hiding, moving into more comfortable territory. There's this thick undercurrent of anxiety running through the entire project, as you might expect, as to when it's all going to implode or fall apart. But there are moments where it feels like Tyler Joseph is starting to find a bit of a comfort zone in his experimentation. Maybe not clarity, but a bit of stability. It's where he's a little bit more plain-spoken in describing his own implosions on Choker, where even as he says, "Nobody's coming for me," he can't quite escape that trail of denial that ran through Good Day, where he knows that the industry's ripping him off wholesale on the clunkier The Outside, probably the weakest song on the album, but he questions just how much of what's being built on them is already obsolete, maybe regional at best. And yet, for as hollow as it might feel on the surface, as the album builds into the middle section, you can tell that Tyler Joseph is trying to reassemble the pieces, make the pop songs, do the quiet hard work of self-care. Saturday is disaffected, but there is some structure being found. Never Take It has him tear away from the living hell that was media in late 2020 by learning a new instrument, where you can tell he's got a death grip on that veneer of ignorance that he desperately wants to preserve, even though he knows he kind of shouldn't. And both Mulberry Street and Formidable have him recognizing how out of place he feels in a bigger environment, and how much he yet cherishes a very real connection that's actually stuck by thick and thin. He's almost a little bit intimidated that they have. And if we're looking at a through line that's being strengthened and reinforced across this album, it's family, which, if you know 21 Pilots, has been a topic and subtext that they value a lot more in their art than a lot of their peers. But also, given how quarantine reinforced that isolated lockdown, you can see just how much Tyler Joseph clung to so many of those connections, especially that to his wife, who gets referenced more frequently here. But you know, it was never built to stay like that. And just like with Blurryface's final two cuts, as the quarantines lift and the world opens back up, they are coming for him, to drag him back into the larger world, force him to leave a stability that he's built for himself to be that icon yet again. And this is where I have to bring back that moral ambiguity, because this is not an easy answer. If we take No Chances as the moment where the Dima returns, and then expand upon that metaphor, reinforced by how Tyler Joseph has said the song's choral presentation was inspired by all the stadium concerts, and that's so telling, well, it highlights just how the Banditos, they didn't just take off for the hinterlands to go exploring. They may have gone underground, went to drill into the old-fashioned roots of Tyler Joseph's creativity and to rebuild from scratch what might give him the most inner peace. And yeah, it might be corny and dated, and he can't quite escape the lingering feeling of dread that he will be found and pulled back into that larger world. And it is quietly ironic that he winds up making even more commercial music as a result. But in a way, I kind of find it very revealing of where Tyler Joseph found his emotional core. And I kind of really appreciate that it's a lot more normal than anyone would expect, almost refreshing in how honest it feels. But you know what? He was on that path to some form of peace. But those deeper insecurities, that industry, that fan base, they are always going to find him. And that's why Redecorate hits so hard as the closer. He knows he's got to leave that home that he's building, be a goner back on the road. And in the first two verses, he frames that question of what he's leaving behind. Note that he does want to go on some level. The moral ambiguity is in the frame. He's not castigating everyone that wants 21 Pilots back in the world, but he talks about a parent losing a child, or whether they will leave that child's bedroom the same or they redecorate to move on. So not only is the family connection first and foremost on his mind, but he's also very conscious of his legacy, reinforced by the final verse where he moves subtext into text and places this album's stream of creativity as he himself references that focal point. The art is his brainchild, and you can tell he's openly questioning all of it. He's wondering if this is going to be the part of his legacy, whether or not he should just do it all over again. Maybe it's because it feels it's compromised by the label, or it's tepid. Maybe it's because this revealing of a self-care journey that doesn't really look all that good in full view. When Open Mike Eagle made Anime Trauma and Divorce last year, we saw all the truth of that. Another album that's also all about family. Or maybe it's because this is what the Bandito always wanted to do. This was his moment of escape, and he's unsure of how everyone will take that. You know, on the first half dozen or so listens to this album, I'll admit I was underwhelmed. And again, if you were someone coming on board with a monstrous dark swell of Trench, or you were a diehard fan before Vessel and Blurryface, I get why you might consider this Blurryface Part 2, now complete with ripping off all their imitators, or ripping off. And indeed, I can see this as an album that actively works against itself. It's their most commercial and pop, but so aware of the underlying hollowness that it would creep through every pore. An album desperate to put on an earnest show, but can never properly sell it when racked with the anxiety that it should be doing something better. Where you could argue that it's all self-consumed wank in the mold of "Hey look ma, I made it," and I don't even think I can fully disagree. You know the album this probably reminds me the most of? Taylor Swift's Reputation, another tangled pop mess that was eating its own tail to barely conceal the numbness within. But there was a therapeutic element to both of those albums, and Scaled and Icy is acutely aware of every step within it, and the complexities that come with that. A command of atmosphere that Taylor Swift never even attempted to hold on her project, and as such, well, you know, I'm kind of weird when it comes to my 21 Pilots takes, but this might be my hottest to date. Even if I think Trench has stronger highlights, I think I like Scaled and Icy as the better album. It's deceptively much lower stakes, but it meets them. Or it's lower stakes when it comes to the broader universe, but the emotional stakes are more there. It builds tension with a lot of subtlety. There is that core to this album that can often feel so disconnected on Trench. And that pop sensibility, always been one of 21 Pilots' greatest underappreciated strengths, it's back at the forefront and on a tighter and more openly populist project. Now that being said, I don't exactly know how much you can appreciate this album even without the larger context of continuity, and even if I appreciate Mike Elizondo and Greg Kurstin providing some noticeable punch-ups in some of the production, I definitely agree in terms of standalone pop songs, it might lack some of that truly killer flair. Strong if unconventional hooks, but not the best that this band has ever written. But for me, you know, I'm a sucker for this sort of thematic territory, and 21 Pilots in pop, where their sheer craftsmanship puts them on top of so many in their competition. Again, I've heard this done so often, but so much worse. And you know, with that added level of polish, I might like this even more than Vessel. 8 out of 10. I think this is going to be one of the most widely dismissed and misunderstood albums of 2021. And even though I would agree it's a grower, it's one that deserves a bigger chance. Give it that additional chance. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I just know this is going to irritate and peeve so many people, but again, I think there's more to this album that's being given credit, and I really think this deserves more listens. I know some fan bases are tearing it apart, especially all those who hopped on board with Trench, but again, there's more going on. Give it a chance. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help vote on what albums to come up on the next episode of On the Pulse, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated, and because I'm already kind of overwhelmed over there right now. I'm trying to get through as much as I can, but sometimes you gotta do the solo reviews. Again, the clicks, they come in for albums like this. But hey, if you want to get involved, I'd be happy to have you. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.